Okay. There we go. Hey, David, I'm gonna spotlight you for a moment.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to welcome everyone this evening. Shalom. I want to thank Reb Lisa for hosting this evening. Reb Lisa is a very new member of our staff at Kolel. Kolel is based in Rockville, Maryland. We are a Jewish renewal community, and you can find out more about us if you're not familiar on our website. And I just want to say this is they're obviously for everyone a very, very difficult time. For those living in Israel, those living in Palestine, in Gaza, those living in the United States, wherever in the world. Many of us just feeling just at a loss, given what has transpired over the past 8 weeks, and even, for some of us going back before that. This evening, we have a very special guest. We thought that it would be important to share with our community and others who are interested something about the history or the roots of Zionism. It's come to my attention even more so over the past number of weeks, just how little many of us know, or how some of us have forgotten, some of our history and the roots of the birth of the modern state of Israel. And so we thought, well, this would be an important evening to offer to our community and also a larger public. So we want to welcome Eric Gartman. Eric has a love of history and has made it his mission to write history books. He hopes that by writing accessible and interesting accounts using eyewitness testimonies, he can bring the past to life. He studied history as an undergraduate at the University of Arizona. Anyone else here go to the University? Just raise your hand. And he went on to do graduate work at the University of Virginia. Anyone attend the University of Virginia? And the National Defense University. He currently works for the Department of Defense. And there's a lot more to his background. He lived in Israel for a number of years. Maybe, Eric, you could say something about your personal connection, your family connection to Israel. And he is deeply, deeply aware of what's going on and deeply concerned. And we are so happy that you are here with us this evening to help us all understand a little bit more of our history. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, David. Great to be here. Great to see all of you, and I hope you all are going to learn something tonight. So the way the format is going to work tonight, I'm going to start off by speaking, for roughly about an hour, and then at that point we'll be turning to the question and answer session. And Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're asking people to send you the questions.
Yeah, they can direct message me, and I'll ask questions when we get to that point.
Okay, very good. So that's how we'll do it.
Thank you.
So we're gonna go ahead and get started exploring the roots of Zionism, and I definitely think you all are going to learn something that maybe you didn't know, and probably quite a bit that you have forgotten. And of course, this is very important and very timely. Although I am going to point out that even if you come out of this with a better understanding of history and the origin of Zionism, it might not necessarily make the present and the future any easier to fathom. So let's go on over to share screen. And we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to go switch over to slideshow so you can see it a little bit larger. All right. Now, as of course you all know, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, of course, was the traditional home of the Jewish people. However, in the 2nd century of the new era, there was a massive revolt in Judea known as the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Roman Empire. And it failed, and partially as a result of that, the Romans expelled the majority of the inhabitants of the Jews from the land of Israel, from Judea. And not only that, but they even changed the name of the territory. They changed it to Palestine, named after the Philistines, in the Bible, in Hebrew, of course, the Plishtim, and that's where that term comes from. So for the next 2 millennia, the overwhelming majority of the world's Jews did not live in their ancestral homeland in Judea. And by the beginning of the modern era, by the late 19th century, the overwhelming majority of the world's Jews are living under the Russian Empire. However, in 1881, there is a massive change, and it begins with a series of pogroms that take place within the Russian Empire. And it starts off a chain of exodus from Eastern Europe. And that's what we have here. You see this picture on the left. We have a group of Jews fleeing their shtetl as it burns in the background. They pretty much went anywhere they could to find safety, and the largest number went to the Golden Medina, the Golden Land, also known as the United States. And that includes the majority of the people right here, your ancestors, your grandparents, your great-grandparents. That's how they ended up here. They were living over there, under the Tsars in Russia. It was a tough life, but it wasn't really unbearable so much until the pogroms began, and that's when they started coming over here to the United States in massive numbers. However, at the same time, right after those pogroms really got going, there was another option, and that was a return to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, the traditional home of the Jews. And as Abba Eban, the former foreign minister of Israel, so eloquently put it, multitudes of Jews, wherever they lived, saw their spiritual home as rooted in a remote land which none of them had ever seen. But they were not rootless. They always felt that Eretz Yisrael was their homeland. So,
Eric, before you go on, can you turn your volume up on your computer? Some people can't hear you.
turn the volume up on my computer?
Yes, from your end on your microphone.
The challenge is if you can speak a little further from the mic, that would help.
Let's see. Further from the mic rather than closer to it?
Yeah, I'm confused now. You sound fine to me, so let's just keep going. If you can just go up and just raise the volume a little bit. It's just a little bit distorted, but it's great for me. Let's keep going.
All right, well, I adjusted my microphone, so we'll see.
Okay, great. Thank you.
If that helps.
Okay.
So in the aftermath of the pogroms, there were a number of intellectuals who advocated a very different idea, not going to the United States or Great Britain or Argentina, but a return to Eretz Yisrael. They weren't called Zionists at this point. That term doesn't really come into use until roughly about a decade later. So what we now refer to these guys as are proto-Zionists. So one of them, Moses Lilienblum, he had survived one of these pogroms in Odessa. And, we have his diary entry, of what it was like, during the pogroms. He's writing, about how the mobs are rampaging, and he's hiding in the cellar. And then he decides it's time for everybody to return to the land of Israel. He writes, "Our future is fearful," meaning here in the Russian Empire, "without a spark of hope or a ray of life. We will be slaves and aliens and strangers forever as long as we stay here in Russia." But then he says, well, why should we be aliens in an alien country if the land of our fathers has not yet been forgotten and remains vacant? It can absorb our people, and we should go there. Another one of the first is Leo Pinsker, who publishes a pamphlet. It's not really a book; it's more of a pamphlet called Auto Emancipation, just less than a year after those riots, and he also calls for the Jewish state, and he uses some powerful language. Here's what he writes. He writes that to the living, the Jew is a corpse; to the native, a foreigner; to the homesteader, a vagrant; and to the proprietary, a beggar. To be poor and exploited, to be a patriot, a man without a country; for all, a hated rival. So it's very strong language, and quite a few people do take note of what Mr. Pinsker has to say. There is another intellectual, this man pictured here on the left, Max Nordau. He writes a little bit later than these other two, and what he's remembered for, among other things, is that he proposes a vision of Zionism as what he calls a Jews of muscle, meaning people who are going to be farmers, who work the land, and who participate in self-defense, as opposed to the situation in Russia, where the Jews are not farmers because they are not allowed to own land, therefore they can't be farmers. And like a lot of the other first Zionists, he sees agriculture, he sees farming as the key to creating a new society. That way you can be self-sufficient. So from the very beginning of the Zionist movement, agriculture is an absolutely huge part of their vision. So it's not just intellectuals who are taking part in this movement. There are the people on the ground who are actually going to Eretz Yisrael to settle the land. And sometimes these people are referred to as pragmatic Zionists, as opposed to the intellectuals, who are writing these books and coming up with these ideas. So there's several groups forming in Russia after these pogroms, specifically designed to have Jewish people return to Eretz Yisrael. Leo Pinsker, the man we just talked about, he becomes the sort of the de facto leader of one of these groups, the Belu. And there's another group, the Chovevei Zion, which means the lovers of Zion. And in their manifesto, the Belu talk about a pillar of fire on the road to Zion. It's a reference to the Bible, because in the Bible, the Hebrews, I guess they weren't quite the Jews at that point, they followed the Lord's pillar of fire from Egypt through the Sinai back to the Promised Land. And now the Belu are using that imagery. a pillar of fire leading the Jews away from oppression, away from Russia, as opposed to away from Egypt. This spark is again kindling and will shine for us, a true pillar of fire going before us on the road to Zion. And in their manifesto, they say to their brethren in Europe, particularly in the Russian Empire, your situation is hopeless. The star of your future is gleaming in the east, meaning Eretz Yisrael. And right there in their charter back in 1882, they say very clearly, we want a home in our country. It was given to us by the mercy of God. It is ours as registered in the archives of history. So almost immediately, the following year, 1882, these immigrants arrive in what they refer to as the Eretz Yisrael, but what in that time was referred to as Palestine, and they started 4 agricultural settlements. When they get on the ships on the way to Eretz Yisrael, they have these very romantic notions of how it's going to be. Everything is going to be perfect. Everything is going to be wonderful. They're going to be the first Jewish farmers, because Jews were not allowed to own land in Russia, so they couldn't farm. They were all going to have sheep and goats and horses and in the land of milk and honey, and everything is going to be wonderful. However, when they arrive at these sites, including this one pictured here on the left, Rishon LeZion, which means first to Zion, one of them writes, well, the site was a bleak wilderness. And, not only that, they don't have a steady supply of water. They have to carry it from a local stream several miles every day. So instead, they have to dig down through rock about 70 feet until they finally strike water. And that helps them quite a bit. But the real problem here is that because they weren't allowed to farm, they don't know how to farm. They really have no idea. They're not used to this particular type of work, and they're not used to the climate in a different part of the world. It's a lot hotter in Palestine or Eretz Yisrael than it is in Russia. So things are very, very difficult for the very first settlers. The land that the Lovers of Zion, which wasn't a particularly well-funded organization, was able to buy, was the only land that they could buy, meaning the cheapest land, the land that nobody else wanted. So it tended to be strewn with rocks. Some of them had marshes. They all had flies. And pretty much all of the new arrivals at one point or another came down with malaria. And anybody who's ever had malaria, of course, knows that it basically incapacitates you, and they can't get any of their work done. Meanwhile, the living conditions are extremely primitive. They haven't built any homes. There's no running water. They don't have any furniture. They barely have enough food, not to mention all the kinds of critters that were running around in this new land that they had never seen before. As for the actual work that they're doing, farming, well, we have a really nice description, really graphic description from one of those first settlers who's talking about what it's like, when he takes out his hoe, and he says he just doesn't really know what he's doing, so he's just using it and he's sort of striking out in every direction. But he's going too fast, his hands blister up, and then they would start bleeding. And after a while, he's had enough, and he puts down his hoe, but then he remembers what they're doing there in the first place. They're there to demonstrate that the Jews are capable of being farmers, capable of running their own country. So then he took up his hoe again, and he kept doing it until he collapsed. And that experience was certainly not unusual for the very first of these settlers. The slogan for the first Zionists was a land without a people, for people without a land. You remember one of those first proto-Zionists had mentioned, he didn't quite use the exact same phrase, but he says the land of our ancestors has not been forgotten by us, but there are no people there, and we need a country, so we should return. But it's not quite the case that there are no people there. Estimates vary quite a bit, but in 1882, there are somewhere between 250,000 and 400,000 Arabs living in Palestine or Eretz Yisrael. A much smaller number of Jews, mostly living in the cities, Jerusalem, Sfad, Tveria. The overwhelming majority of the Arabs on that land were peasants, were farmers, just like these people here pictured on the left. These are Arab peasants picking olives, which was one of their main industries. One of the settlers wrote, "Before going to Palestine, the country in my imagination appeared as one city inhabited by non-religious Jews, surrounded by many fields, all empty, waiting for more people to come and cultivate them." And one of the main founders of Zionist ideology, a man named Achad Ha'am, who advocated what is referred to as cultural Zionism, in 1891, pretty early on, he wrote that abroad we're used to believing that Eretz Yisrael is now almost totally desolate, a desert that is not sowed. But that is not the case. It is difficult to find fields that are not sowed. So pretty early on, the Zionists realized that it's not a completely empty land, and that there are some people living there, but they didn't see it as a problem. In 1884, a report from the Chovevei Zion said, "It is not true that the inhabitants of the country are hostile. It is not even possible that they will be more evil or uncultured than the Russian peasants." He's, of course, referring to the pogroms. So, he says, well, it can't possibly be that bad. And as for reports of attacks by veteran robbers on Jews, those are merely tall tales. So early on, we have this understanding among the Zionists that there are people there, Arabs to be specific, but it doesn't appear to them at the very beginning that it's going to be an issue. One of the first people who came to Palestine in the first wave of immigration in 1881 was a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda. And as he's going towards Palestine, him and his wife made an agreement that they would only speak Hebrew at home and raise their children speaking Hebrew, because he wants the language of the new state to be Hebrew, the language of the Israelites in the Bible. If their language is Yiddish, then it's just the transplantation of Yiddish culture from Eastern Europe to Eretz Yisrael. But remember, that's not what they're trying to do. Remember, they're trying to build a new type of Jew, a national revival to take place in Eretz Yisrael. And Ben Yehuda's efforts are very important in that. Pretty soon, the kindergartens at those new settlements are teaching their children exclusively in Hebrew. And it's not long before Hebrew becomes the language of all of the settlers in the area. So that's very important for the Zionist movement. Nonetheless, for the first 20 years of the movement, it is completely teetering on the brink of collapse. It is true that, in addition to those first 4 settlements that we saw, more settlers come in, but a lot of them don't stay. The life there is just too difficult for them. And in fact, the pioneers have to turn to Baron Edmund de Rothschild in order to save them from bankruptcy. But that defeats the whole purpose of the enterprise. The whole purpose is to have your own state, to show the rest of the world that Jews can have their own country and do things just like everybody else. So dependency on a wealthy man in France is not the point. So after the first 20 years, what is referred to as the first Aliyah meaning ascension, which is how the immigrants refer to it, there's only about 5,000 of these settlers living on, scattered villages throughout the country, mostly surviving thanks to Rothschild. So it's not clear after the first 2 decades of this movement whether or not it's going to succeed. And the smart money, if you were looking at this objectively at this time, was that this movement is going to fail. It's just going to be a footnote in history, and that's about it. But it doesn't turn out that way. Because outside events intervene. And one of those main external events is the Dreyfus affair in 1895. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish captain in the French army, and he was accused incorrectly of spying for Germany. So he is publicly degraded. There is a ceremony that takes place at the French Military Academy, and one of the reporters who's there to watch it is a man by the name of Theodor Herzl from Vienna. And he writes about it, and he says Dreyfus was left forward, and then he was told, "You are unworthy to bear arms in the name of the French Republic. I degrade you from your rank." And then a large sergeant stepped forward and tore his epaulets off his uniform, took Dreyfus's sword, and broke it over his knee. And that you can see that's what's happening in the picture there on the left. "In the name of the French Republic, I degrade you from your rank." But Dreyfus shouted back, "I forbid you to insult me. You will tell the whole of France that I am innocent." Meanwhile, there's a crowd who's watching this, and they start screaming, "Judas, traitor, death to the Jews. Bring him out here and we'll tear him to pieces." And Herzl, who is a very well assimilated, very well educated gentleman from Austria, from Vienna, one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Europe, can't believe it. Death to the Jews? The French people does not want to extend the rights of man to Jews, he says. Prior to the Dreyfus affair, Herzl was a completely assimilated Jew who was actually quite taken with European culture. And he had written several plays. I really enjoyed European high culture. But after this event, he turns to Zionism. Now remember, he's not the first Zionist. We had those proto-Zionists, as we saw beforehand, but he is going to be the most important one. And only a short time after witnessing the degradation of Dreyfus, he publishes a pamphlet called The Jewish State, calling for the Jews to leave Europe and create a country of their own. He's a very good writer, and he's able to really reach his audience, particularly the Jews in Eastern Europe, more so than the Jews in Western Europe, even though he himself was from Western Europe. And he writes about it, in glowing terms. He says, this idea must radiate out until it reaches the last wretched nests of our people. They will awaken out of their dull brooding. And what glory awaits the selfless fighters for the idea. That is why I believe that a race of wonderful Jews will grow out of the earth. The Maccabees will rise again. So this really caught the attention of the Jews, of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, where things are much more difficult. When I read it to the end, I felt I had become another man. One converted Zionist writes to Herzl. So Herzl immediately is catapulted into the leadership of the various Zionist groups, and he puts them together into a more permanent organization, the World Zionist Organization. And he brings all of the various delegates together in one place for the first time in 1897, pictured here on the left, for the world's first Zionist conference. And as Herzl is giving the keynote speech, he is quite aware of the importance of this moment. So he stands, as straight as he can. He's wearing his best clothing, and he says to everybody, "We are here to lay the foundation stone of the house which is to shelter the Jewish nation. And we will not relapse into the previous condition of disorganization," which is what had happened before. That there were various groups, they didn't particularly work well together, it was more or less chaotic. But now he wants to ensure that there is one permanent organization that is going to take charge and lead this entire movement. And as he says those words, the delegates rise to their feet and cheer him. So it's a very important moment. And afterwards, Herzl says, at Basel, I founded the Jewish state, and in 50 years, everybody will know it, which is quite amazing because the Jewish state came into being 51 years later in 1948. So he's quite the prophet. He's a very charismatic man. And under his leadership, the Zionist movement, what is referred to as diplomatic or political Zionism, really takes off. He's certainly able to gain a lot of converts to Zionism as he goes, throughout Europe to meet with various groups, Jewish communities. And it doesn't really matter where he goes; wherever he goes, the Jewish communities there greet him as a hero. He's also able to meet with world leaders with the specific goal of getting a charter for Jews in Palestine. He meets with the Sultan of Turkey, and that's important because it's actually Turkey who owns that territory at that time, and he really wants to get a charter from them. He's not quite able to do it. He also meets with the Kaiser of Germany and even with the Pope. He's never able to get it, though, never able to get the legal charter. And he dies unexpectedly in 1904 at a fairly young age. He's only 44 years old. And the worry was that without Herzl, the Zionist movement is going to collapse into what he referred to before as the previous condition of disorganization. And it doesn't. Even though there is a temporary gap in the Zionist leadership. There isn't anybody immediately after Herzl's death who has his same charisma and his same authority. But interestingly enough, right at the time that he dies, the Zionist movement picks up again for different reasons. There is another round of pogroms in Russia in 1903 at Kishinev. And these are more violent than the first round. So that sends off a second wave of emigration, from the Russian Empire. And once again, most of them come here to the United States. But a fair number of them, the second Aliyah, end up going to the land of Israel. And unlike the first round, the second round are better prepared. They've got a more clear idea of what to expect and what they're trying to achieve than the previous round. And of course, it certainly didn't hurt them that there was at least some infrastructure built by the original pioneers. So, the second round of immigration comprises maybe about 40,000 people. It lasts for about 10 years until the First World War. So the people in the second Aliyah, they come up with some different methods. One of these are labor battalions. So a group of these idealistic young people would set out and clear some newly bought patches of land, preparing the soil for the permanent settlers who would follow behind them. And that's what we have pictured here on the left. Some of these young pioneers working in the labor battalions heading out to clear the land. They're also influenced by the idea of a different type of Jew. They are drawing a clear distinction between themselves and the old yeshiva buchers, the yeshiva boys back in the old country. These people, they don't want to live in cities. They don't want to be shopkeepers. They don't want to be students in the yeshiva. They want to be new Jews, just like Max Nordau said, Jews of muscle. Their slogan was to build and be rebuilt. They're both building up the land and rebuilding themselves. And they sort of mocked the Jews in the old country, calling them huge heads on chicken's feet. People, who aren't healthy, who aren't physically fit, we're going to be different than that. That's their vision. They also demanded what they referred to as the conquest of labor, which means that in order to achieve this goal of creating a Jewish state, they're only going to hire other Jews to work the land. Then that's the way to become self-reliant. One of the key components of the pioneers in the second round of immigration is socialism. They're going to share the work and they're going to help each other. And all these ideas come together and as they create new types of communities, which they are particularly well known for, moshavim and kibbutzim. In fact, it's hard to imagine a more potent symbol of the early days of the Zionist movement than the kibbutzim themselves, where everybody contributes, everybody works hard for the common good. And here is the origins of the first kibbutz in 1909 in the northern part of the country at Degania. It wasn't necessary, it clearly was not something that they had planned ahead of time. It was an improvised solution that included their various ideas, socialism, farming, and put them together. And one of the immigrants in the second round is a little guy from Poland named David Green, who later changes his name to David Ben-Gurion. And he talks about how important the kibbutz was and about how it creates a new type of person. He says they're country boys, smelling of wheat and manure. Their faces are sun-bronzed. And that's what Ben-Gurion wants to see. He wants to see more Jews like that. Ben-Gurion himself had taken part in one of those labor battalions. Remember, these people who go and clear the land, he was a plowman in these labor battalions. It was tough for him though, because he wasn't particularly physically fit. So eventually, of course, he takes a desk position and of course becomes the founder of the modern state of Israel. There is one issue that disrupts some of the heads of the Zionist movement, however. And at 1905, at the World Zionist Conference, you see it's still taking place, even without Herzl, but they're still doing it annually. One of the leaders who was from Palestine, one of the Zionists, named Yitzhak Epstein, pictured here on the left, talks about what he calls the unseen question, or the hidden question, depending on how you translate it. And he says that's the issue of the Arabs, the local population in Palestine. And he's explaining a lot of this to the Zionists at the conference, who are not actually living in the land. They're still, a lot of them still living in Europe. And what he explains is that the issue of their relations with the Arabs is more important than any other subject. And that's despite the fact that Zionist literature to that point barely dealt with it, which is why he refers to it as the unseen question. Zionist literature, up to this point, it's about getting out of the old country, going back to the land of our ancestors, which is empty, and rebuilding ourselves and creating a new society. And that's all they talked about up until this point. But Epstein is trying to rephrase it now. And he explains what's happening on the ground. He says, he tries to dispel the misconception that the land in Palestine lies uncultivated. In fact, there are very few deserted fields. He also explains, while we feel a deep love for our land and the land of our forefathers, we forgot that the nation who lives in it today also has a sensitive heart and loving soul. And he says, just like anyone else, the Arab is tied to his native land with strong bonds. However, Epstein thinks he has a solution. He wants to make sure that no Arabs would be uprooted from their lands. And what he's referring to there is the way the Zionist movement is working is you would have the Zionist organization buy some parcels of land. Most of those parcels of land were owned by absentee Arab landlords who didn't live on that land. They lived in one of the cities, maybe Beirut, Jerusalem, or Haifa. And then the Zionists would come along and offer to buy their land at a much better price than they could expect otherwise. So they sell the land to the Zionists. But when the Zionists come in, remember, they demand the conquest of labor. We're only going to hire Jews. So if there are any Arab peasants in that area, they would have to leave because they didn't own the land. The land was owned by that landlord. So the peasants, had to get up and go somewhere else. Some of them went to the cities. Some of them, went to try and farm other places, and some of them tried to get employed by the new arrivals. So Epstein is trying to say, well, we can't do that anymore. We have to make sure that that they're not uprooted, that they stay put. Therefore, the Jews and the Arab farmers would live side by side, and that's going to be a good thing, he thinks, for the Arabs, because the new immigrants coming in from Europe with their more advanced scientific methods are going to able to help the Arabs become more productive. And Epstein is convinced that if none of the Arab peasants are uprooted from their lands, and if they actually receive material benefits, then there aren't going to be any problems. So the idea here is that the local population, the Arabs, are going to benefit from the Zionist influx, and not just that their lands will be more productive, but just in general, commerce is going to expand, and the Jews are going to bring in advanced medical care, and what have you. And Epstein thinks that if we do everything properly, it's going to be a blessing for both parties. Everybody is going to benefit. So this has a major impact on the Zionist movement, particularly among what we now refer to as the labor Zionists, the socialists, who dominated the second Aliyah. So this becomes their solution, and that's the line of thinking that they adopt, that our presence is going to help the Arabs materially. The second Aliyah came to a close with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. And as all wars are, it's very destructive, and the population of Palestine, both Arab and Jew, declines actually drastically during the course of the war. However, there is one major benefit for the Zionists, and that is that the British released the Balfour Declaration in 1917, declaring that it looks with favor upon the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And this is the actual document itself. Here on the left, you can read the whole thing there. So you remember that Herzl, this is what he had been trying to do. He had been trying to get some sort of legal charter to Palestine, and now they have it. So the Zionist leader who was most responsible for it was Dr. Chaim Weizmann, and he's absolutely elated. It seems to him and to a lot of people that that there is now going to be a Jewish state, even though at the time that the Balfour Declaration was released, the British didn't even hold the territory. But a very short time later, the next month, the British take Jerusalem from the Ottoman Empire and end up taking the rest of Palestine from the Ottomans. So now it's a double whammy. They have the legal charter, and the people who issued the legal charter have the land. Nonetheless, the number of immigrants, of Zionists, of Jews in Palestine at that time, 1917, 1918, is still fairly small. There's only been 2 rounds of immigration, and neither one was particularly huge. However, in the wake of the First World War, there is a civil war in Russia in 1919. And out of the chaos, more and more people are fleeing from that area. And in order to help those Jews who flee from Russia to Palestine, a new organization is set up, Hechalutz, which means the pioneer. And they have training centers on farmlands where they're actually going to teach people the skills that they're going to need to learn when they go ahead, when they go over to Eretz Yisrael. And it's not just a question of skills, it's ideological as well. And we have a picture here on the left of some of these people being trained for their new lives in the Holy Land. The organization was set up by a army veteran, a Russian Jewish army veteran, Joseph Trumpeldor. And here's how he talked about it. He says, "Let us be pioneers. Let us sow the seeds a handful at a time until we conquer the land of Israel. We need people ready to serve at any cost, at whatever task Palestine requires. Is there a wheel lacking? I am that wheel. Must the land be dug? I will dig it. If you please, I am ready to do it all. I know only one command, build." And that leads us to the third round of immigration, the third Aliyah, roughly from 1919 to 1923, on top of the first two rounds. So now the number of Jews in Palestine is starting to increase. Moreover, unlike under the sort of the chaotic Ottoman Empire, which wasn't exactly the greatest government, the territory is now being ruled by the British, who agree to increased Jewish immigration as well as land purchases in the course of the 1920s. As for the Zionist movement, it's increasing in its funding as well. And the Jewish National Fund purchases a large plot of land in the northern part of Israel in the Jezreel Valley. When the first pioneers arrived there in the Jezreel Valley after that plot of land was purchased, it was a malarial wasteland, which is not an exaggeration. The young pioneers, they went in there with the labor battalions in the lead, slowly settled the land, but they also brought in some engineers who were able to build irrigation, the sort of advanced agriculture that the local population, the Arabs, absolutely did not have. They're also able to improve their healthcare because malaria is still a major problem, but they're draining swamps and they are improving the health system as well. So this photo here was taken in 1924, just a couple of years after the kibbutz in Harod was founded out of this malarial swampland. So this is one of the signal achievements of Zionism. And they refer to it, as a romantic enterprise, as a malarial wasteland was transformed into one of the glories of Jewish Palestine. And if you want to read a really great account of this event, there is a book called My Promised Land by Ari Shavit. Sure, some of you are familiar with it. It was a bestseller a few years ago, and for good reason, because he is an absolutely terrific writer. Highly recommend that book. But the Arabs don't see it in the same glorious terms as the Zionists did. Remember, we were talking about how Yitzhak Epstein was saying, we have to make sure that when we buy lands, that none of the Arabs who work there would be forced to leave. But it didn't work out that way, because the immigrants are still demanding the conquest of labor, that everybody who works on the land is going to be Jewish, because we're trying to build up a new society. So quite a few of the Arab peasants who had formerly lived in that territory were forced to evacuate. And this really creates tension. And the Arabs, who live in Palestine, they're starting to get a sense that all of them are threatened. If there's one or two land sales here and there, and some peasants, are forced to leave, well, it's not a national problem. But there's more and more of these Europeans coming in that don't show any sign of abating. And if they continue to come in, they're going to continue to evict us from our land, and the entire character of Palestine will change. It's not going to be an Arab country anymore. It will be a Jewish one. And this is the real crux of the problem here. And as early as 1914, one of the Arabs in Jerusalem issues what he calls a general summons, and it says, "Do you wish to be slaves to the Zionists who have come to expel you from your country, saying that this country is theirs?" It seems clear to this man, the anonymous author of the general summons, that the Zionists are there to steal their land, and what the Arabs have to do is stand up for it. Now, as for the identity of the Arabs at this point, they don't think of themselves as Palestinian Arabs. There's no separate national identity, that marks them off as Palestinians who are distinct from the rest of the Arab nation who live in the territory around them. They think of themselves as Arabs who live in Palestine. Now, why is that important? Well, it's probably not quite as important as both sides make it out to be. In this conflict between the two sides, both sides are trying to rewrite history. And the Palestinians are trying to portray the people who lived there at this time as a separate nation of Palestinians who thought of themselves as such, and therefore it was their country. That's definitely an exaggeration. But regardless, even if they weren't Palestinians, even if they were Arabs who lived in Palestine rather than Palestinian Arabs, they certainly did think that the land was theirs, and were not willing to cede the territory to a separate group of people. Now that brings us to 8 o'clock. So did Lisa, did you want to stop here or for questions? Or should we continue?
Do we have any questions, or do you want to go for another 5 minutes, folks? You can just I kind of was wanting to hear about the little next phase, and then we can stop for questions. Okay, does that sound good?
I second it.
Okay, good. Let's keep going for a minute, Eric.
All right. Well,
maybe one more slide.
Well, it's up to you. However many you like.
Yeah.
Nobody,
because we did start. We started a little bit late, so let's do one more slide about the first uprising.
Okay. So the first large-scale violence between the two communities occurs in April of 1920. So a lot of pilgrims had gathered at the Haram al-Sharif, which is what the Jews, of course, refer to as the Temple Mount or the Har Habayit. And the Arab leaders are calling for Arab independence from Britain, as well as an end to the Zionist enterprise in Palestine. And the leaders are able to whip the crowd up into a frenzy. We think there's, somewhere in the range of about 600 people who were gathered, for this. And after listening to these speeches, the crowd erupted and went on a rampage into Jewish Jerusalem, which is, of course, West Jerusalem. This was completely unexpected, and the British were caught completely off guard, as were the Jews. This continued for about 3 days. There were looting shops, as well as stoning them. Because the British were caught completely off guard, and because they weren't able to put down the violence for 3 days, the Jewish community decides that it's time to establish a nationwide defensive organization, which is called the Haganah. Now, of course, there had been in the various agricultural settlements, there had, of course, been watchmen at the settlements. Hashomer is the Hebrew word, but in terms of of a nationwide defense organization, absolutely no, there was nothing, and that was a direct result of these riots in 1920, and it was just in time because the next year, 1921, there is a much larger riot. The causes are, of course, similar. The Arabs of Palestine are demanding, once again, independence from Britain, as well as an end to the Zionist enterprise, which they fear is going to displace them, is going to kick them out of their own country. This time, the violence is on a much larger scale than the previous year, despite the fact that the Jews had organized this defensive organization, the Haganah. So this time they're fighting back. Unlike the previous year where they had just been caught by surprise. And it's pretty violent. It goes on for several days, the two sides fighting each other, and about 100 people have been killed by the time it's over, and obviously quite a few more have been injured. Yet the Zionist leadership at this point, after these 1921 riots, doesn't really view it as a national problem, as a problem that is going to possibly threaten their entire enterprise in Eretz Yisrael. David Ben-Gurion explains the situation in terms that could have been written by Yitzhak Epstein. If the Arabs agreed to our return to our land, we would help them with our political, financial, and moral support to bring about the rebirth and the unity of the Arab people. The Arabs of Palestine would remain, and their material position would improve. So once again, it's this argument that by having these European immigrants, with their improved knowledge, whether it be of commerce, of science, whatever, it's going to be good for the Arabs. Therefore, they should agree to our return to the land because they will benefit as well. However, during this time, during the 1920s, there is a second opinion on this subject within the Zionist movement. And that is the opinion of Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who starts the right-wing movement of the Zionists. Most countries have, the right wing and the left wing. The same thing happens here with the Zionists. At first, there was only the labor Zionists, but now there's a right-wing movement, the revisionists, also known as Beitar, and he sees it in a very different light. He argues that we can't have peace with the Arabs until the Jews were strong enough to make the Arabs realize that we can't be driven off. And it's only once we build this iron wall that we will be able to stay here in peace. Therefore, he says, we have to build up our strength, our defenses. He also explains the underlying problem in terms that are very different from how the left wing, how the socialists explained it. He says the tragedy here lies in the fact that there is a collision between two truths. And yes, he adds, our justice is greater. But he understands the situation very differently. He says the Arabs loved their country as much as the Jews did. They understood what the Zionists were doing. And just like any other group of people, they look upon their land with fondness, just as we do. Every people fought immigration and settlement by foreigners, however high-minded their motives were for settling, referring to the Zionists. So to Jabotinsky, this isn't some sort of misunderstanding. He thinks that the Arabs understand the situation quite well. Therefore, he refers to it as a natural conflict. He doesn't demonize the Arabs, or see them in a negative light. He just explains that there's a conflict of interest here. And the way to settle this conflict of interest, he says, is to build up that iron wall and make them realize that they have no alternative but to accept Jewish settlement.
Wow. I think that's probably a good place to break.
Okay.
I think it gives us a really good window into what the roots of this conflict are right now, actually. And I do have a question already in the chat room for you, Eric. And if anyone has any other questions, just write them in the chat for me. And the question is, many people call the early settlers colonizers, and I've heard that before too. And Linda asks, she's wondering if you think that what you think about the use of this term, because I've heard that term sort of bantered about a lot.
Well, you're absolutely right that you have heard that term a lot. And to this day, that remains the standard Arab Palestinian line about the early settlers, that they were colonists. And the only way you can support that contention is if you don't know what a colonist is. So what is a colonist? A colonist is somebody who comes from the mother country, who comes over and says, I take this territory here on Plymouth Rock in the name of England. And I am going to settle on this territory in England's name. And of course, those colonists are also generally going to come heavily armed in order to stake their claim. None of that happens in the situation that we're talking about. There is no mother country. The first pioneers who came across, who came over there, didn't come there like let's say how the Spanish conquistadors came to Mexico, with arms and weapons, looking to loot natural resources from the territory. They came there as farmers. And it isn't until 4 decades later that they finally establish a defense force, the Haganah, which was in response to attacks from the local population. So, the whole colonist argument, quite frankly, is quite silly. It plays over well, however, for several reasons. And that's the more interesting question, is why that argument plays well. So among the various groups who it's intended for, it resonates quite well, because there is a large part of the globe who were the victims of colonization, imperialism by the European nations, and they look upon that time as a very bad time in which they were exploited by the Europeans. So it appeals to that group of people. It also appeals to a lot of intellectuals in the West who view colonization and imperialization by the Europeans as a terrible thing. And of course, it appeals very much to the Palestinians themselves, because by portraying the Jews, the Israelis, as colonizers, they're able to label them as an outside force that came in, invaded their country, and took their country, which is how they see it. It is true that that's the way the Palestinians see it. They see the Jews, the Zionists, as outsiders, whereas the Zionists, of course, see themselves as direct descendants of the Israelites who originally had that territory and were expelled from it and were coming back in order to reclaim their land.
Yeah, I think that's a very good answer. Does anyone else have another question for Eric? I actually have one. You said after the Bar Kokhba revolution that most of the Jews were expelled from the land, but what about the Kabbalists that lived in Sfat? I mean, weren't there always Jews living on the land over those 2,000 years?
That's why I said most.
Okay, okay, but that's like really important. It's a really important group of people in Sfat, because the Kabbalistic Judaism sort of grew out of that, even though they were going to Spain and they were doing all that. Yeah, I was just wondering, how many do you think stayed?
Right. So there were three main centers of Jews in Palestine. One was the one you just mentioned, Sfat, also Tiberias, and of course Jerusalem. After the expulsions by the Romans, the people in those three communities were never particularly numerous. Important, but never numerous. And by the modern era, by the time of the first Aliyah, the total number of Jews living in Palestine is only about 20,000.
Oh. Still, that's more than I thought. That's interesting. So there was a Jewish presence all the way through, it just not many.
That's correct.
Anybody have any other questions for Eric before we wrap up tonight? We didn't, we have a little bit more time, but I think we're getting to the end of our time, and we do have another session that we're going to be hearing a lot more about this history, because we really haven't even dipped in. We haven't even gotten to Menachem Begin yet. He's one of my favorite, characters in this whole scenario. What's going to happen next?
Begin is the intellectual heir to the man we just discussed, Jabotinsky. Right. He's the one who picks up his mantle.
Yeah, very interesting. Wonderful. And the book that we're talking about that of course that Eric wrote is Return to Zion. If you haven't got the book, I highly recommend that you do. I should be ready to put that in the chat room just in a moment. I was going to do that so that you would be able to get that. But I will definitely have it sent out to everybody who registered for this program. And we do have another program scheduled. It's going to be happening on Thursday, December 14th at 7. It's the last night of Hanukkah, so we're probably going to do maybe a short Hanukkah lighting, and then we're going to go on and learn more about the history of Zionism and the roots of Zionism. I think there's one more question. Let's see. There's Noam says, in addition to the fellow, sorry, I don't recall his name, who was sensitive to the need to address the concerns of the Arab, I think it was Epstein, the Arab population. Were there others in the early years, like 1905, who took up that issue of being sensitive to the population of the Arabs?
Well, absolutely. So what happened is, Epstein was really the first one who brought it to the attention of the Zionists, particularly those not living in Palestine. And once he brought that issue forward, and explained, look, this is the most important issue that we face. It's actually the settling of the land is not going to be the hardest thing. It's dealing with the people who live there. Once he explained that, they became aware of it, quite quickly, and they adopted his solution, which was that the Arabs would benefit from the presence of the Zionists. So the answer, Noam, is yes. Good question. I did kind of, wonder, we're going to be talking about sort of the second half, of this in our next session. This was just the first half of two parts. So, I kind of wonder, how familiar you all are with any of this. Is this completely new? Is it something you've heard bits and pieces of? So on and so forth. Don't be shy.
You can unmute and talk if you'd like.
I'd like to comment, which is I'm familiar with this general history, but it is helpful to go over it from a new perspective, from your perspective as somebody who's really thought about this and digested it, and I've learned some things. And I'd like to say one other thing is I went to a little lecture by one of our local rabbis in Bethesda about Ben Gurion, and he read from a biography of Ben Gurion in which he quoted some little statements and anecdotes from Ben Gurion that made it look rather like Ben Gurion himself was pretty aware of the conflict and had, feelings along the line that the direction he'd most like things to go would be for the Arabs to go away. But that it makes the statements of the labor movement look more like very carefully crafted, the best things to say at the time, as opposed to the things that Jabotinsky would say, which wouldn't really have appeal outside of the narrow space of the people most involved.
Okay, thank you. That's correct. And let's also remember how that Ben Gurion's views do change over time. We will be discussing that in the second half. We've talked about how up until this point that we've reached, he's more or less in line with what Yitzhak Epstein said. But over the years, as things get worse, he's going to take a different position privately, although not necessarily publicly.
Karen has her hand raised.
Yes, Karen, sorry, I was speaking to Karen.
Yeah, that's okay. Thanks. Thanks, Eric. I guess I want to go back for a minute to the colonial sort of question you got. One of the books that was recommended by Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who's the head of Truah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. I mean, David is certainly familiar with that organization. Was Rashid Khalidis, the distinguished Palestinian historian who teaches at Columbia University, his book, The 100 Years War on Palestine. And so, because I I'm trying to educate myself on this. I've been doing quite a lot of reading. I guess I'm trying to understand. I think the answer you gave was a partial answer, which kind of makes sense to me. But the reality is, I mean, and part of what I'm doing is also reading about historiography. I mean, because there are very contentious debates on both sides of the scholarly literature on Israel and Palestine. And I guess I'm trying to play devil's advocate here. I mean, there are many sort of respected scholars, Palestinian scholars, and I am here, I guess, thinking of Khalidi and Edward Said, who would make an argument about, from their point of view. I'm not saying I subscribe to this. I'm just trying to sort of be fair in the argumentation that Israel is a, quote, settler colonialist state. So I'm just trying to understand, they clearly ascribe to the word colonial something more. I think I have not read Khalidi's book, but I've heard him speak. And I think partly what he would say, and maybe I'm jumping the gun, is that under the auspices of colonial powers, namely Britain and France, that helped to advance, the agenda of the Zionists. But I guess I'm pushing a little bit because I'd like to hear you sort of expand a little bit more, from their point of view about why this was not a colonialist enterprise, since, without repeating myself, there are a lot of, I think, quote unquote, respectable people who will make that argument. So I'll stop there.
So the two authors that Karen just mentioned, Edward Said and Rashid Khalidi, those, are probably the two leading, Palestinian scholars, on the subject. Edward Said, passed away, but Rashid Khalidi is still with us, and he's still publishing books. I tell you that from a scholarly perspective, I'm not particularly impressed with either one of them. They're more of spokesmen for the Palestinian cause than objective authors trying to examine the situation from the point of a third party. So what I mean by that is, let's take a look at how third parties, objective third parties, understand the situation. Whether it's scholars or the governments of the United States or the United Nations, they generally, they look at the various claims from the two sides. One side claims that we've been here for 2,000 years since the expulsion by the Romans, and that these European colonials came here and stole our country. The other side claims that this was originally our land, we were expelled from it, and we returned to it, and therefore it is our land. Just about every objective third party who's looked at it has come to the same set of conclusions. And you probably guess that those conclusions are not that the Zionists were colonialists, and it was not that one side is right and one side is wrong. Pretty much everyone who's looked at this, from an objective point of view, has come to the understanding that we have two competing claims that both are grounded very solidly in reality. And that, in terms of weighing one against the other, which is more potent, it's an exercise in irrelevancy, because both sides do have strong claims. And this whole concept that the Zionists were colonists, that's part of the claim that Palestinians use to buttress their argument. But that doesn't make it true, nor does it mean that the Palestinian argument for their right to that territory is any less potent, even if you throw out the ridiculous arguments, about the Zionists being colonists. They still have a legitimate claim. So the Palestinians, they don't need that argument, about is the Zionists being, colonialist, settlers, imperialists to advance their claim. They don't need it, although, as I've said, it does kind of help for specific groups. It definitely helps them in the third world, because the majority of third world countries have experienced colonization and imperialism. And for the Palestinians to paint their enemy, the Israelis, as settlers, as colonialists, really gets them a lot further with most of the countries in the third world, as well as with the radical left in the first world. However, none of that makes it true. And that's what it comes down to. So, Khalidi and Edward Said, they can write whatever they want, and Said in particular has written some rather ridiculous things over the years. The book that made him famous, Orientalism, he claimed that anybody from the West who wrote about the Middle East or the Middle East was basically a racist, and that they couldn't analyze it objectively. Right? Nobody. Well, there are some people in academia who take that seriously, mostly, the radical fringes, but it's very hard to find any serious scholars who accept that.
Eric, Linda asks, I wonder if one group saying we will help the Arabs in Palestine doesn't somehow speak of a sense of colonialism, in the sense that the Arabs were not involved in the decision making. I mean, were there Arabs on the Arab side who wanted to be cooperative? I was kind of curious about that too. And then we're going to wrap up after that.
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand the question about decision making.
Were they asked if they wanted help?
I can speak to what I'm.
Yeah, Linda. Yeah, please.
So the sense of a group coming in and saying, we can help them advance, sort of presumes that they need help being advanced, they want help being advanced, so-called advanced, and that the way that they're living is somehow not advanced. So to me, I find that a little bit problematic in terms of, I'm not saying they're colonized, that makes them colonizers, but I am saying that there's a certain, I don't know, patronizing is the correct term, but there's a certain assumption that we can make peace with these people if we help them. That sort of assumes that they wanted help, and it doesn't sound like they were involved in determining for themselves what they wanted.
Well, Linda, apparently you can see the future, because that's exactly where we're going to pick up next week.
I can see the future.
That's great. I wanted to thank you so much for this. I thought it would be appropriate to end tonight with a rendition of Hatikva.
שנות 2000 להיות עם חפשי בארצנו ארץ ציון ירושלים.
Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Thank you, Eric, for your insights, and I want to wish everybody Hag Sameach, and I hope to see everybody as we celebrate Hanukkah. And I'll see you on the 8th night of Hanukkah. so we can finish our program. Thanks so
Good
much,
job.
everybody.
And thank you all for your questions. They were very good.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Hag Sameach and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you,
Really.
Lisa.
You're welcome.
Shabbat shalom.
It's only early in the week, but I'm already thinking about Shabbat because it's Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you all being here. Be well.
Eric,
Yes.
can I just ask you something really quickly?
course.
Or do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just gonna stop the recording real quick.